Helen was going to read out a very long introduction, and I said, please don't do that. You will bore them to death and put them off completely. Basically, it was stuff from my web pages, and we are encouraged to really big ourselves up on our web pages. And I read this and I think, yes, I do all those things, but it doesn't really sound like me. I think I suffer from imposter syndrome. So here I am, I'm Christabel. I'm employed at the University of Exeter Medical School. My background is in social science, predominantly sociology. I'm not a clinician. I have the grand title of Associate Professor of Public Mental Health, but I have no qualifications in either public health nor mental health. I really am an imposter. I got into suicide research really by accident. A long time ago, when I was just working as a jobbing researcher, I got involved in a fascinating study. I loved it. I loved talking to people, interviewing people who'd been bereaved by suicide and or were having suicidal thoughts themselves, and I just stuck. And as you'll hear from what I'm going to say, I'm really interested in the role of lay people in suicide prevention, not clinicians, people outside of clinical contexts. And I'm also interested in those people who may be suicidal or may end up taking their own lives, who are not in contact with mental health services at the time, that are not known to be at risk, who used to make up 75% of all suicides. It's now down to about 2/3. That will be clear from what I'm going to tell you. I'm therefore a little bit worried about the talk, because it doesn't directly address clinical practice. But I'm hoping that you'll find something of use in it, possibly see some parallels with the work that you do, and that it will resonate with you, both as clinicians, but also very much as people, because you may be clinicians, but you're also ordinary people as well. When you go home and you take off your clinical hat, you know, you're a mum, you're a partner, you're a friend. So we're all ordinary people as well. So in fact, lay people embraces everybody. Okay, it's safe to talk is an umbrella term that I've started using for a program of work that I've been engaged on for about 10 years now. And it encompasses 3 separate but interrelated studies, which I'm going to share a little bit about with you this afternoon. The focus, as I say, is very much on helping everybody play a part in preventing suicides. And my core question is this. This is my sort of guiding question. Could you offer help to someone who is suicidal? With you being anybody. You know, you, the person on the reception desk in the hotel, the person just driving out of the car park, Mrs. Smith down the road, every man or woman on the Clapham omnibus, as they used to say. This is for everybody. And who are we talking about helping? Well, I'm really interested in looking at the way suicidality, suicidal crises, and the potential for suicide prevention pans out in different social contexts. And 2 of these in particular, I started off being interested in domestic contexts. As I say, I interviewed a lot of people who had been bereaved by suicide, who had lost someone very close to them. And they were telling me about people they knew. And they were talking about private places, what went on in the home, or in social spaces where we meet friends. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that study. That led on to the development of a little educational resource, which is the leaflet on the left. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then over the other side, we've got a completely different social scenario, which is the one you heard about this morning from Johnny and Neil. And that's when you are in a public place and you see somebody about to take their own life and you think, oh my goodness, I've got to say something, or I've got to do something. And it's someone you don't know, complete stranger, in a public place, you've got no support, you're out there on your own, and that's very, very, very different scenario altogether. So these are 3 separate studies, or pieces of work, which I'm going to outline to you. I've been given an hour to speak, and that feels to me, and it will feel to you, like a horribly long time if I just drone on endlessly. So I'm going to take these studies one at a time and have a short break for a few questions between each, just to kind of break it up. Okay. So it all started here. The programme of work that I'm going to describe started here with, you'll all know about World Suicide Prevention Day, 10th of September every year. And back in 2005, they came up with this little strapline. The prevention of suicide is everybody's business. And I think that was the first time that phrase was heard. It then suddenly became commonplace. Now you see it everywhere, and actually it became so well used that I think people have stopped using it, and it's almost fallen out of usage. But back in 2005, it was a critical moment, I think, in the history of suicide prevention and also suicide research. And it started to pop up all over the place on strategies, suicide prevention strategies, this one from Western Australia, subtitled Everybody's Business, campaign materials. We were seeing it around all the time. And it represented a real shift from the previous focus, which was very much on clinical practice and suicide prevention. It's a medical matter, it's the preserve of clinicians. Suddenly, this widening of thinking to whole communities and what everybody could do about suicide prevention. But for me, this raised some interesting questions about, well, who exactly is everybody? And what do we expect them to do about it? And back then, it was really not at all clear. This was another kind of defining moment for me in my sort of personal research journey. And this was a quotation I came across. I have no idea where I came across it. It just popped up on my screen one day, you know, when you're sort of randomly browsing. And it absolutely leapt off the screen, or page, whichever it was, and really hit me between the eyes. Health is created and lived by people within the settings of their everyday life, where they learn, work, play, and love. And it was just, as I say, it was just so meaningful to me. I knew it was trying to tell me something, and it was a while before I worked out what. And eventually I realized this, that it's the same for suicidal crises. They unfold among people within the settings of their everyday life, where they learn, work, play, and love. So those everyday domestic and social settings are where people become suicidal, crises unfold, and are managed, often without any help from clinical services, back to the 75% not in contact, by friends and family members who are, I see, very much as the front line of suicide prevention. And until I did this first study, we didn't know really anything about what goes on in those settings. We knew a lot about clinical settings, as I've said already. We knew a lot about clinical judgment, about the process whereby clinicians identify, assess, and manage risk within their own nicely safe, contained settings. We knew much less about lay judgment, about how risks are identified, assessed, and managed in the context of a mother-son relationship, a husband-wife relationship, a same-sex relationship. Nothing at all. So that was the focus of my first study that I conducted back in around 2009 to 10. And this is starting with the left-hand side in my branching figure. Remember, there's looking at someone you know. This was funded by the Medical Research Council, done with a lot of important partners. But the aim was very simple. It was to understand what a suicidal crisis looks like from the point of view of family members and friends. I wanted to know what it was like to be inside it. What did they see and hear in the period leading up to the suicide? What did they think was happening? What actions did they take or not? And why? Why not? And what knowledge, skills, and support would have been useful to them at the time? The important thing about this is that this getting inside the suicidal crisis, if you think about the position of family members and friends, they're absolutely caught up in it themselves. They're not detached clinical observers or assessors. They're not outsiders. They are themselves players in the drama, and that makes all the difference. So I won't bore on too much about methods, but for people who like to know how these studies were done, this was a qualitative study. So very small numbers, very in-depth, narrative-based interviews, trying, as I say, to get to arrive at what it looked like to be inside that situation. We interviewed people who had experienced a suicide of someone very close to them, either a family member or friend. So these were retrospective interviews with people who'd been bereaved. They'd had a suicidal crisis in the family, it had turned out badly, the person had died, and they were reflecting on it afterwards. As I say, small numbers, 14 cases of suicide, but in each case we tried to interview several people, so we had different perspectives on the same case, so parents, partners, siblings, friends, colleagues. They were young, for reasons I won't go into at this point because it's not necessarily relevant. We focused on the younger age group, 18 to 34s, and they were all not in contacts with mental health services. And for me, that's the really problematic population because, you know, in these cases, friends and family members they're on their own. They're really struggling to know what the heck's going on here and what do we do about it. They haven't got clinical support. So, these are the headline findings, which I'll just run through, and then I'll tell you a bit more. I'll go through each one in turn and illustrate them. Very interesting, and I think very important findings. First of all, warning signs. We all know about warning signs for suicide. Everyone talks about warning signs for suicide. You type warning signs for suicide into Google, you come up with thousands upon thousands of web pages. Every charity, every NHS trust, it's got its warning signs for suicide up there. They make it look so easy. Warning signs in practice are rarely clear or unambiguous. Significant others, second finding, I'll come back to warning signs. Second finding, significant others did something very interesting. I talk about stretching the boundaries of normal. They stretched the boundaries of normal to accommodate loved ones, and I'll come back to that. And thirdly, fear, and I should put fear in capital letters. This is really a talk about fear. This whole talk, in various ways, is a talk about fear. Principally fear of loss prevented them from saying or doing anything that might have prevented the suicide. So let's go through each of these quickly in turn. Warning signs. As I say, it looks so simple. And of course, in retrospect, it is. You look back, the signs are blindingly obvious. But look at this one. This was a father talking about his 19-year-old son. And reflecting on it afterwards, he said, well, it was a bit odd, you know. I thought it was a bit odd. He had a teddy bear hanging from a light cord in his bedroom. Parents walked into the room. They just sort of, what's that doing there? As I say, it's a bit odd. But think about that situation. You don't immediately think, aha, my son is telling me that he's going to hang himself. It's highly idiosyncratic. It's highly symbolic. It's some sort of bizarre rehearsal, performance. But you'd never see this on a list of warning signs for suicide. And a lot of them were like this. Very, very individualistic, very difficult to decipher at the time. Open to a range of interpretations and offset by countersigns, which I'll come on to in just a second. And efforts to communicate distress on the part of the suicidal person were very often ineffective. Very often they had in some way tried to communicate what was going on for them, but they'd done it in a very oblique and ineffective manner, like this one. Often whilst under the influence of alcohol. So this is a mother talking about her son who was in deep trouble, but she wasn't aware of how much trouble. A few times he rang me in the early hours of the morning, absolutely piddled out of his head, and he'd be gabbling on, sobbing, but I couldn't understand a word he was saying because he was so drunk. And I'd say, look, I'll come and see you tomorrow, and we'll talk about it then. And then I'd go there and nothing would get said, and he'd seem all right. And this is very, very typical. He tried to tell her. He was finding it difficult. He's a young man trying to talk to his mum, not easy. He needed the alcohol to disinhibit, to get up the courage to talk about it, to open up. But the alcohol scrambled the communication. It rendered it incoherent, and crucially, alcohol predisposes the listener to disregard what they're hearing. Oh, it's the drink talking. Oh, it's just the alcohol. So she says what anyone would say, look, I'll come and talk to you in the morning when you're sober, but of course in the morning when he's sobered up, he can't do it. So he seems all right. So what she's describing here, and what a lot of people described, was getting two conflicting or contradictory sets of signals. So on the one hand, yes, there are some signs of distress, of something odd going on, something not quite right, agitated, crying, grumpy, drinking more, sometimes even talking about suicide. But that's offset by a completely different set of signals. The person's calm, they're laughing and joking, they're going to work, they're talking about the future, it all seems like life as usual. They're also giving explicit denials and reassurances. No, I'm not thinking about suicide. I'm all right, Mum, don't worry about me. So what's happening for the observer, in this case the significant other, the scale is going like this. Is something wrong? Something not wrong. Something wrong? Nothing's wrong. Something's wrong? Nothing wrong. It's like this, now you see it, now you don't. And so many people told us this. In almost every case, the balance came down on nothing wrong. Significant others resisted warning signs due to a whole lot of unconscious biases, which I haven't got time to go into now, but unconscious biases cause us to resist, to deny what we're seeing, to resist the warning signs. They resisted labelling behaviours as deviant, abnormal, or symptomatic of mental disturbance. So what do we do when we see something in front of us and we're not quite sure, we think it's a bit wrong, but we don't really want to believe that it's wrong? We find plausible explanations. We normalise and legitimise behaviours. We say, oh, it's just normal teenage moodiness. Or, oh, he's under pressure at work, this is just normal response to pressure. We normalise, we find excuses for people for behaving in the way that they are, even though deep down, somewhere inside us, there's a little alarm bell clanging, saying, no, 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 it's not right, but we ignore it. And what we do is I have this notion about stretching the boundaries, which you'll see in this next quote. This is a mother talking about her son. He's in his 30s. And he's really struggling with his sexual identity. He's really in a bad way. He's very, very confused. Relationships are going wrong. He's not sure why. He's not sure who he is or what's going on for him. And he's desperately trying to communicate with his mum. She reports afterwards. He said something like, "I'm not normal, Mum. I'm a miserable failure, and I'm not normal." And I said, well, what's normal? You're my son, and I love you, whatever you are. I didn't want to show disapproval. I just wanted him to feel accepted. So he's trying desperately to communicate. She's not hearing. But she's not hearing because she doesn't care. It's the reverse. She's not hearing because she loves him too much. And her unconditional love and acceptance of him makes it impossible for her to recognize that actually he's in deep trouble and he really needs help. Third finding, back to fear. Fear of loss prevents people from saying or doing anything. Even when the distress is really clear, significant others felt unable to say anything to the distressed person, share their concerns with other members of the network, or seek help outside the social network. They were absolutely paralyzed by fear of saying the wrong thing, of making the situation worse, of tipping the person over the edge. Fear of damaging the relationship. What they're trying above all to preserve is the social bond, the relationship with that person. They don't want to jeopardize the relationship by barging in and saying or doing the wrong thing. So it's fear of loss. But look at this. This is the most poignant of all my stories. This is a young man talking about his female partner. She was 26. She'd been disturbed since teenage years, very clearly disturbed, had all sorts of troubles. At this point, she was living with her boyfriend. She was talking about suicide, explicitly talking about suicide, talking about the hymns she wanted to have at her funeral. She could not have been more direct. And he says, I was very worried about her at this point, and I thought, do I raise my concerns about her with her mother? And I thought, oh no, she'll go bloody do-lally if she finds out, and that'll really set things off. I'd given her my word that I wouldn't talk to her mother, and I didn't breach that trust, but I wish I had. And then a little bit further on in the interview, he's talking about the GP, and he says, yes, I knew I needed to get her to the GP, but I was trying to find the right words and the right opportunity. It's bloody difficult, and I was afraid that she would react badly. The situation was delicate, and I had an awful lot to lose. And I ended up losing it anyway. This young man knew that something was terribly wrong. He knew what he should do: talk to the mother, get her to the GP. He just couldn't summon the courage because he was afraid of destroying the relationship, losing her. But by not doing it, he lost her anyway. So love and loyalty can have fatal consequences. Okay, conclusions from this study. I started off this study thinking, yeah, family members and friends, front line of suicide prevention, they must be best placed to spot the signs and intervene. And I came away from this study thinking, no way. They're in the most difficult position. They have to make these highly complex judgments. They're untrained, unskilled. They have to make incredibly complex judgments, weighing up signs, countersigns, what's going on, within complex real-life contexts with other stuff going on. This is not happening in a vacuum. They've got other stuff going on, other demands, busy lives, work pressures, other people in the family with problems. Lots of noise, signals getting lost in the noise. And their emotional investment, their involvement in the relationship makes it impossible for them to see clearly. They see the person they want to see, and impossible to do anything because it's too risky. So they are assessing risks. I used to think lay people didn't do risk assessment. What we see here is actually they are assessing risks, but it's the risk to the relationship which is their primary concern. Safeguarding the relationship is what they're really wanting to do. And crucially, the last point, within close personal relationships, people are not rational actors. They are driven by their emotions. And this is really important. It took me a while to get to the significance of this point. It's really important because all our public health messages are based on an assumption of rationality. Recognize this? This is a typical public health message that assumes that if we tell people what signs to look for and what to do when they see them, they will see the signs and they will take the action. It's based on a very simple, what I call a see-do model, or there's a variant of it, which is more relevant in suicide prevention, see, say, do. So see this, do that. See this, say something to the person and get them to the GP or whatever. See, say plus do. It's a very simple model. Does it work for suicide prevention? Well, certainly when emotions are involved, when personal relationships are at stake, whether it's love, trust, loyalty, faith in someone we love, we have this. They can't see, they can't do. Can't see, can't say, or do. They're stuck. So, the implications of this for me then was I started to call for what I call a more emotionally informed science and practice of suicide prevention. I absolutely firmly believe that we have to understand what's going on emotionally for people. When you look back at suicide, certainly suicide research, and I think suicide prevention practice, it's all based on this assumption of rationality. And what we've got to understand is that, in our human relationships, we're totally driven by emotion. So I wanted to start shifting the focus from imparting knowledge, just telling people, these are the warning signs, look out for them, and if you see them, do this, to really trying to help people acknowledge and overcome their fears. This focus on fear, I think, is crucial. The fears that arise in everyday settings, in our everyday lives, that those settings, back to the WHO quotations, the settings in which people live, work, play, and love. So that was my first study. I'll go one slide further, and then we'll have a quick couple of minute break. I presented this work, once it was completed and written up, I presented this work to a meeting of the Alliance of Suicide Prevention Charities. And they were all really interested, they loved the quotations, and they really got the message, and I was really on board with it. And then somebody piped up and said, yes, but what are you going to do about it? And I thought, do about it? I'm a researcher, I just find things out. I don't really know how to do stuff. But you run charities, so you know how to do stuff. So maybe we could do some stuff together. And that was the start of another part of the journey. I knew that there was something important here. I knew there was something in these findings that was really different, that just wasn't being said, and that I needed to communicate it somewhere other than in a paper in a scientific journal. And I was actually in my own GP surgery one day, looking around, just bored as you are, and I saw a rack of leaflets on the wall, about, concerned about your loved one, are they suffering from dementia, concerned about bowel cancer, concerned about this, that, the other. And I thought, have I ever seen a leaflet concerned about suicide? And I realized I hadn't. And I thought, why is that? And how might I write one? How might one write one? And I started to play around with this. And it was sort of a bit of a challenge to myself. I talked about it with a few people, and a lot of people said, no, it can't be done, it's too difficult. You can't put that stuff in a leaflet and leave it in a GP waiting room. It'll put ideas in people's heads and all these silly, again, fear. And I thought, well, blow it, I'm going to try. So I tried, and I played around, and I did it. And you have copies on your table. I invite you just to have a look at it for a few minutes while I'm talking. And if you'd like to give me any feedback at the end, that would be lovely. I'd never done anything like this before. I had no skills or qualifications in this kind of thing. It's still, I'm slightly embarrassed about it. It still looks very, very amateurish. It was really just an experiment, a shot in the dark. But it has actually been remarkably successful. It's kind of taken off a life of its own, and it crops up everywhere. I see it lying around in all kinds of places where I don't expect it to be, which is really rather nice. So what I was really trying to do in this leaflet, it was really a first attempt to bring out into the open and explicitly address some of these emotional blocks that I'd been discovering, especially this whole thing about fear. I am convinced that the single biggest barrier to suicide prevention is fear. It makes me very cross when I hear people going on and on and on about stigma, which they do. And I think, what the heck is stigma? What does stigma mean? Does anybody know what they mean by it? What is it? It's not I can't define stigma. I've studied Goffman as a sociologist who wrote a whole monograph on stigma, and I don't know what it means. It's a complete nonsense word. What people are really talking about is fear. Fear is a concrete feeling. We know what it is. We feel it ourselves. And if I have one plea, one message for you to take away today is this: please stop talking about stigma and start talking about fear. So that's what lies behind this, and I wanted to a lot of the words used in the leaflet, they come from quotations, things people said about the way they were feeling, what they were fearing. So I wanted to do two things. I wanted to start to recognize the complexity, this notion that there is not just a single set of warning signs. There may be, There may be some signs. You may see some worrying things. They may be quiet, brooding, withdrawn, distant, agitated, etc. But you're also likely to see some reassuring signs. They'll be telling you they're fine. They'll be busy, chirpy, getting on, going to work, telling you not to worry about them. It is not straightforward, and it's this balancing act. You see this, you see that, which do you believe? And then I wanted to make explicit and address some of these common fears, particularly this one about the relationship. What if I say the wrong thing? It could damage the relationship. And you saw that quotation from the young man who resisted talking about it for fear of losing the person, and he lost her anyway, forever. And then I wanted to, again, this doesn't go very far, but it's just a little bit about how to start the conversation. And again, really explicitly acknowledging that this is not easy. It is scary, starting this kind of conversation. It might feel really risky, but it is safe. It is safe to do it. It's safer to do it than not to do it. So take the leaflet away if you like. Do what you like with it. There are lots of copies around. If you want to take a few and spread them around, that's fine. What we did with this, I was quite concerned because this was just a step in the dark. I wanted to know, I wanted to evaluate it in some way. So working with the charities, Alliance of Suicide Prevention Charities, who put up some funding, and my local public health team at Devon County Council, who were hugely supportive, I wanted to do some sort of evaluation. Before I get there, let me just talk about the target audience. So it's for members of the public, it's concerned family members and friends. I didn't design it specifically for health professionals, but actually what came out of the evaluation was something quite interesting. So I'll come back to that. It was for I have this person in my head called Mrs. Smith, whom I think about all the time. And Mrs. Smith is a mother. She's a lot of mothers that I spoke to who had lost sons to suicide. And she's very worried about her son, who's broken up with a relationship. He's in financial trouble. He's got all kinds of stuff going on, and she really doesn't know. She doesn't know what's happening for him and what she ought to do about it. And this leaflet was written for Mrs. Smith. But where is she? How do we reach her? No idea. So I sat and talked about this with the public health team. We had long discussions about it, and we drew up a systematic distribution strategy to try and get this leaflet out across the whole of Devon. And we did it via frontline community agencies. We sat and stormed and wrote down all the community agencies we could think of that people might come into contact with at times of distress or trouble. So CABs, local authorities, housing departments, job centres, libraries, churches, youth services. We just, I've got another slide with all the details on, but hundreds of frontline community agencies that we thought might be able to make use of it. And we sent it out to them with a letter from the Director of Public Health asking them to use it in whatever way they wished. 15,000 copies right across Devon in one go, and we followed it up with an evaluation, a pretty simple evaluation. What was really interesting, people loved it. I was really concerned that people might be really resistant to it, they might be fearful, they might think it was risky. Nobody identified any risks, everybody seemed to love it, they all wanted more. What was interesting was agencies were using it in ways that I had never envisaged. I just supposed that they would put it in a rack in the GP waiting room like all the rest of them, and it would sit there waiting for someone to pick it up. And actually they were doing much more creative things with it. Some of them were giving it out selectively to a targeted recipient within the context of some sort of consultation. So for instance, this was a student health service saying that all the time students are coming in and telling us that they're worried about a friend. They're not coming in because they're suicidal, they're coming in because they're worried about a friend. So the student, the professional, gives them the leaflet, talks them through it, and gives it to them to take away, to keep in their pocket, keep in their bag. It's there for when they need it, a bit of a safety net. And people were talking about, I have this leaflet all with me all the time. It's still warm because it's always in my pocket. Frontline non-health staff, so people like environmental health officers, suicide prevention is not their bag. We don't think of them as being involved in suicide prevention, but of course they come into contact with vulnerable people all the time in the community. Very often isolated people with no friends or family, so the environmental health officers were using it themselves. They were having the conversation with the vulnerable person, and it was giving them the confidence to do so. And it was used sometimes by HR departments. So we sent some out to companies, large companies within the county, thinking again that they might sort of distribute it, put it in a staff room or something. Actually, they were being much more proactive. They were using it within HR departments to structure conversations with vulnerable members of staff, people at risk of redundancy, which was really fantastic and encouraging. We're now on our third print run, so that's 45,000 copies, and that's within Devon alone. And lots of institutions, agencies all over the country have also made it their own. They've put their own colours on it and their own logos, and it's kind of out there living its life, which is really exciting. So that's the second piece of work. And then I promised, if you remember the branching arms at the beginning, there's a third study which links in with Johnny and Neil's talk this morning. Going back to, we're now on the right-hand side, and we're thinking about what happens when it's someone you don't know, when it's in a public place. I've actually had a long-standing interest in suicides in public places, going back to 2006, actually, which is a hugely long time ago, when I had the opportunity to write some initial national guidance. It was commissioned by what was then NIME, which some of you will remember, and it was some action on how to manage what people were then calling suicide hotspots, which is a term that I'm proud to say I have managed to persuade them no longer to use. And in 2015, I was asked by Public Health England, 2014, I was asked by Public Health England to update this document. It's a bit blurry, you won't see that. That's the document there. And I was working on this in early 2015, thinking about what do we do to manage the risk of suicides in public places, and there was set a bunch of things that we do, like putting up fences, raising the fences on bridges, really good evidence for reducing access to means. There's a lot about stuff about putting up Samaritan signs. You'll have seen Samaritan signs on bridges and high places. There wasn't much to say about human intervention because at the time there was no evidence. We didn't know anything about human behaviour or human intervention at... Do you know what I mean by public places? By the sort of places that are regularly used for acts of suicide, so bridges, cliffs, high places, and also roads and railways, some of which are frequently used for suicide. And I was working on this. I was working on this PhD document in 2015 when Johnny's documentary, The Stranger on the Bridge, popped up on the television screens. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. You know, I've been looking for some scientific evidence to inform guidance about human intervention at high-risk places, and here's this amazing story. It's not evidence, it's an anecdote, it's a single story, but maybe we could gather some more evidence. So I contacted Johnny immediately. I got talking. It resulted in a lovely research partnership that subsequently brought Neil in, and it resulted in a study which was really almost a replication of the first, insofar as we very much used the same narrative interview methods. It was also funded by the MRC, so it was a sort of a natural follow-on from the first study. And the aim was to gain an in-depth understanding of stranger on the bridge scenarios. Scenarios like Johnny's and Neil's, not necessarily at a bridge, could be any public place. And I wanted to identify the core components of an intervention, an effective intervention by a member of the public. I really wanted to know, what does a safe and effective intervention look like? And then again, to translate that into some simple public education messages and materials. So again, we did narrative-based interviews, again, quite small numbers, but very in-depth, really getting to the heart of the story. With two groups of people, Johnny's and Neil's. So we found 12 people like Johnny, who had experience of being stopped by a passing stranger from taking their own life in a public location. Some of them more than once. So they, between them, talked about 19 successful interventions. And then we found a group of Neils, who were people with experience of intervening to prevent a stranger from taking their own life in a public location. 21 of those, and again, some of them had done it more than once. And they talked about 31, described 31 successful interventions. So between the two groups, we had 50 narratives of intervention to look at. Fabulous, fabulous data set. And what was really nice about this was that these were successful interventions. These were people who were still living, as opposed to the previous study where it was all, where things went horribly wrong. So very different feel to it. I'm not going to tell you much about the findings. The data are all analysed, the findings are there. I have a paper written up and just about ready for submission any week now. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm sort of building a model of effective intervention, which I haven't put on here because I'm not quite happy with it. But I will give you just these few key findings. Again, comes back to the same thing. It's not about reasoning. There was not one story in which someone was talked out of suicide. Reason, argument, logic did not come into it. The successful interventions that we looked at were not crisis negotiations. The people intervening were not trying to be crisis negotiators. They were not trying to be therapists. They had no specific skills. They were ordinary members of the public, civil servants, teachers, lecturers, all kinds of people, really, really mixed bunch of people. They didn't have any training. They didn't have any specific skills. Some of them were rail staff who'd had a very basic half-day training from Samaritans, but most of the other members of the public had nothing. They were winging it. They didn't know what they were supposed to do, but they saw something. They saw somebody sitting on a bridge like Neil saw Johnny. They knew they had to say something, and they just went and did it. And they made it up as they went along, and it worked. And even now, looking back, they don't know how it worked, but it did. And that That actually was a really exciting finding. But it was the role of emotion. The point here is that it's all about feeling, not reasoning. What you say, the message is, what you say doesn't matter nearly as much as how you make the person feel. This came through really strongly. For the suicidal person, it was about feeling safe and feeling validated, feeling like, hey, somebody cares. You know, what makes the difference? An ordinary person who cares enough not to walk on by. And that, it comes out so strongly. It's extraordinary. So interveners don't need a script. They don't need to be told what to say. They need to know just how to make the person feel. And what was really important was this sense of, authenticity. The intervener needed to, the suicidal person needed to feel that the intervener was authentic and that they genuinely cared. The interveners, when we look at them, as I say, they're ordinary people. They don't have any special training. They don't have any special skills. What was really unusual about them, though, was their lack of hesitancy. And I don't know if what Neil said this morning, but I've heard Neil's talks. And the other interveners were like him. They saw something odd. They knew it was odd, and they had a quick little debate within themselves. Shall I do something? Shall I not? Shall I carry on, go to work? But what if? And then they just went and did it. They weren't necessarily fearless. They felt the fear, and they did it anyway. And that's the message I want you to take away. Feel the fear and do it anyway. That's the take-home message. You will be fearful, but it is safe to talk about suicide to someone you're concerned about, whether you know them or whether you don't. Thank you.